Is it possible that the COVID-19 vaccination could become compulsory in the United Kingdom? Welcome to my channel. If you're just joining our legal community, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and hit that bell icon so you don't miss out on new videos. And before we get started, I did a poll as to which story you'd like me to tell you over on my other channel, Black Belt Secrets. 550 of you voted, so thank you very much for taking part, and by some margin 39% of you went with the question, how I ended up being a barrister. So that story is going to go live later today over at Black Belt Secrets, so make sure you check that out as well. So COVID vaccines. I checked the statistics this morning that says 37.9 million people have had their first dose and 22.6 million people have had their second dose. But against a population of 66.6 million people, that leaves 28.7 million people who have not yet had their first dose. So what happens if those 28.7 million people simply refused to have a vaccine? Is it possible for the government to make it mandatory for all of those people to have the vaccine? The short answer is, with the current legislation, it is not possible to make the vaccine mandatory. It would require new law. But as usual, the longer answer is a little bit more complicated. But first of all, it might interest you to know that vaccinations were at one stage mandatory in the United Kingdom. The Vaccination Act of 1853 made it compulsory for all children to be vaccinated against smallpox within the first 3 months of their life. And any parents refusing the vaccination would be fined the sum of £1, which, remember, would be a lot more valuable then than it would be today. There were various amendments to this law, and it wasn't until 1946 that the National Health Service Act repealed the original act and was no longer mandatory. So under the current law, it is simply not possible to force somebody to have a vaccination. They must provide consent. And the situation with children, as you might imagine, is that parents must provide consent. And there is no implied consent either, which means if they are carrying out vaccinations in schools on a given day, sending your child to school does not mean that you are giving that consent just because you've sent them to school. There must be a separate form of consent. It's not implied by the fact that it's happening on that day. If somebody cannot provide consent for themselves because they're not what we call Gillick competent, then they might have someone else make decisions and provide consent for them. There's a lot of discussion, and I should say misinformation, about the Public Health Control of Disease Act and the Coronavirus Act, that these acts make it possible for the government to enforce vaccinations, but that's simply not true. These acts simply provide the framework for the government's response to something like this pandemic. Sections 45B and 45C provide that ministers may make regulations for the purpose of preventing, protecting against, controlling, or providing a public health response to the spread of infection. However, Section 45E provides that those regulations may not include a provision requiring a person to undergo medical treatment. And medical treatment includes a vaccination and other prophylactic treatment. And there are similar provisions in the Coronavirus Act. In other words, these acts of Parliament allow the government to make regulations in order to deal with the spread of disease, but they do not provide the power in and of themselves to force somebody to take a vaccination for it. But as to the possibility of the government making it mandatory, the strict answer would be yes, but it would require new law for the government to be able to do so. Such an act of Parliament would have to go through all of the normal stages for new legislation and be given royal assent. But you can imagine that such an act would not be particularly popular with any party that were to bring in such legislation. So in my view, it's simply not going to happen. Not to mention that there are also arguments based on the European Convention of Human Rights. For example, Article 8, which provides that everyone has the right to respect for his private and family life. And whilst there are always academic arguments on both sides, they tend to fall in favour of the person whose rights are being protected, save in the most extreme cases. There have also been lots of discussions floating around online as to whether somebody could be detained under the Mental Health Act for the purposes of a vaccination. So let's take a look at that. Under Section 3 of the Mental Health Act, a patient may be admitted to hospital and detained for treatment on the grounds that he's suffering from a mental illness, psychotic disorder, or it is necessary for the health or safety of the patient or protection of other persons. But if the argument were made that a vaccination would be used for this purpose under this section of the Act, we need to look to Section 63, because Section 63 provides that consent is not required for treatment for the mental disorder that the person is suffering. So again, this is an act of Parliament that in its current form does not allow for mandatory vaccinations. Mandatory vaccination is lawful, however, in the United States and has been for some time. It's commonplace for many states to require children to be vaccinated before entering school, for example, although some states allow parents to object on religious or similar grounds. There is also a broad discussion as to whether an employer can force you to have a vaccine before coming back to work, or indeed force you to have a vaccine full stop, else face being dismissed. This is a topic I will discuss in much more detail in another video, but broadly speaking, if an employer does dismiss you because you haven't or refused to have a vaccine, then only in the rarest situations can you actually prevent that dismissal from taking effect. However, it will be open to you to seek advice regarding an unfair dismissal. But the difficulty here is that a vaccine is not necessarily based on a protected characteristic. But as I said, I will go into much more detail in another video, so make sure you subscribe and wait for that one. So we really are at this tipping point now where 37, almost 38 million people have had their first dose, but almost 29 million people have not had their first dose. But whilst it's theoretically possible for the government to legislate for mandatory vaccinations, I think it's highly unlikely. There's clearly going to be lots of discussion and comment about this subject, so please drop your comments down below. Make sure you read the official websites if you are in any way unsure about the vaccines, and get the information directly from source. As I say in lots of my videos, don't rely on something you read online, don't rely on the views and comments of other people. Go directly to an official source to read about the vaccines. And don't fall victim to any of the vaccination scams that I discussed in an earlier video. I'll link that down below as well. So don't forget to check out my story later. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.